Well, it looks like the queue is slowing down, so let me go ahead and get started again. I'm Ann Bartuska, moderating today's session on behalf of the Forest Climate Working Group and the newest installment of the Latte and Learn series that we've been doing. This one is to focus on harvest wood products. And if Kylie, could you actually show the slide that we'll use for context? For those of you who've logged in on the Latte and Learn before, you've seen this graphic, and we're trying to use it as a way to tie all of the issues that we're covering together, such as reforestation, wildfire, other carbon sinks and sources. And basically it's showing that the carbon source in red versus carbon sink in green. And if you look at the entire forested landscape, there's a lot going on at any time. Today, what we wanted to do was focus on this bit, which is where you are actively harvesting the wood, which is in some ways becoming a carbon source. But then what we want to do is get into more details on what does that mean as that wood is harvested, it goes into products. And the whole notion that harvested wood products can play an important role in increasing carbon sequestration and the storage capacity, actually extending the storage capacity of forests through utilization. And so today we're going to do a little deeper dive on that subject. We have three great speakers for you to be hearing from in order, and I'll just introduce them now. And then when we get into the session, we'll have a nice seamless transition from one to the other. The first will be Dr. Katie Fernholtz, who is president and CEO of Dovetail Partners, a nonprofit environmental think tank based in Minneapolis. Katie is a forester by training with 23 years of experience in the forest sector, and she is focused primarily on sustainability concerns and the different measures and the characteristics of sustainability, with some focus on smallholder and family foresters. Our second speaker will be Dr. George Berghorn, who is assistant professor of construction management in the School of Planning, Design and Construction at Michigan State University. His research is focused on building deconstruction and material circularity, reuse of salvage wood, salvage lumber and mass timber products, barriers to mass timber construction, and really focusing on the whole new emerging area of mass timber and CLT. And the third speaker, tying everything up with, as he usually does, tying up the loose ends, is Dr. David Ware, non-resident senior fellow at Resources for the Future, who had previously spent more than 30 years with the U.S. Forest Service Research and Development as senior research scientist and leader of national and regional resource assessments. So that is our lineup for this morning. As usual, what we ask you to do is to put questions you might have in the chat, and I will go ahead and curate at the end when we get into the Q&A session. I actually have a couple questions already that have been posed that I may start with. So please feel free to be putting any kind of question you have in the chat, and we'll be covering those as we go in at the end of the session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Fernholtz and ask her to make her remarks.
Thank you, Ann, and please let me know if you can see my screen at this point. Thank you, Ann. Good. And to be clear, I do not have a PhD. Thank you for the upgrade in my academics, but just to have the record show that I'm not Dr. Fernholtz, but wish someday I'll get an honorary degree. Just let that be on the record that I'm in the market for an honorary degree. But thank you, Ann. Thank you, fellow panelists. Thank you, attendees, for the opportunity to be here. I am Katie Fernholtz, as Ann said, with Dovetail Partners, and I am zooming in today from just outside Minneapolis, Minnesota, the traditional lands past and present of the Dakota people, and just to recognize all of those people that have stewarded the land past and present and allow us to have the abundant, diverse resources that we enjoy today and that we are stewards of for the future. I am going to speak briefly on forest management, sustainability, touch on carbon, but our other panelists are going to go into some more detail. So from me, you're going to hear very, very high level stuff. And I am always honored by the opportunity I have to speak about forests. Forests are special beautiful places. They are complex, they are dynamic, they are all things and more. And so the opportunity to work in the forest sector and to spend my day job with forests is a great pleasure in my life. I think they're just spectacular, and I hope you all love forests as much as I do. This is me when I'm not in a Zoom meeting in a very happy place in northern Minnesota, and some of the many forests that I enjoy. I hope you all have special forests in your life as well. So like I said, I am going to be at this very, very high level, starting globally. And this slide is showing around the world trends in forest area. Some of the nations around the world are shown in red. These are regions of the globe where we see forest area declining. Many of the countries on this map are shown in white, and these are areas of the world where forest area is stable. Additional areas of this map are shown in green, and these are areas of the world where forest area is increasing. So one of the take-home messages with this is, again, forests are dynamic. Many different things are happening in many different places. And at a global scale, at a national scale, there are many different stories to tell, many different challenges, many different opportunities. We are fortunate in the United States to be in a part of the world where at a national level, our forest area is increasing. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that and the opportunities that presents for us here in the United States. So it hasn't always been this way in the United States. We have a complicated history with our forests. There is an era within the United States, depending on what part of the country you might be most familiar with, where forests have been terribly exploited. That is part of our history. That is part of what we can learn from. So I want to share with you a series of slides here. Slides, I still use that old term, right? I mean, when it's a picture from 1940, you can use the term slides, right? But this is in Washington State in 1940, and we're going to go through a series of slides here. So 1940 is where we start. Here's 5 years later in 1945. A few years later, 1950, 1955, 1961. 71. And I always like to say, if you don't learn anything else from me today, you'll learn when color photography came on the scene, 1971, according to this series. And this is the final picture, 1974. So this is from 1940, 1974, a 34-year-old forest. And I like to show these pictures because everybody can have their own reaction to what you see in these pictures. As a forester, and someone who cares deeply about the forest, these pictures mean so much to me because they remind us of the resiliency of the forest, the complexity, the natural, just the vibrancy, the life force of the forest. And they also are humbling as a forester in terms of how much we have to learn from the forest and how much we can work in concert with that resiliency to be stewards of the forest. But there's so much more in these pictures, right? They remind us of the dynamic nature of the resource, how it's changing, and what we can learn from the past and apply to the present. So forests across the country have changed, and knowing our history of that land use and how things have changed is very important. This is, again, a big, broad, high-level picture of trends in US forest land. And when we look at American history, going back to European immigration, if we want to pick a time in history to measure ourselves against, going back to 1630, estimates are that at that time, there would have been about 1 billion acres of forest in the area of the world that would become the United States. That area of forest is relatively stable, but we go into this period of expansive land conversion in the United States in the late 1800s into the early 1900s. And really what was happening during that period was incredible expansion of conversion of forest lands to agricultural uses, pasture land, grazing, all kinds of other types of land use that trees had to get out of the way for. But we came out of that era. Our land use patterns in the country have changed. And over the last 100+ years, we've had stable to slightly increasing forest area in the country. And I just want for a moment just to think about the last 100 years of American history and how much has been going on, everything from urban sprawl and interstate highway development and you name it. And over that dynamic period of American history, we have kept national forest area stable to increasing. And so one of the ways to think about this is that, we can all imagine places when we were growing up that used to be trees, and today they're not. They've been developed into other uses. But if we travel further from our cities and suburbs, there are vast areas of our landscape that used to be pasture land. But once we all got automobiles, many of those areas have become forests, either passively or through human restoration efforts. So for every acre that's been developed, we've seen acres in other parts of the country return to forest, like I said, either passively or through active restoration. So one of the things I think about in this history is we went through an era of exploiting our forests, and we are living in the era of restoration. Many of the forests that came back after generations of agricultural land use, grazing, other types, those forests and those forest soils need some active tending and restoration. We are living in the era of restoration and caring for our forests coming out of that history. We've seen forest land area expand across the country. This is where we have forests throughout the United States. The darkest shaded counties are areas that have had 50% forest area increase since 1997. So even in the last 25 to 30 years, we have seen forest area significantly increase in some parts of the country. This is a trend that continues as we continue to change our land use patterns, especially the dynamic between forest and farming. That dynamic continues to influence our landscape significantly. We know in terms of sustainability that we've turned the corner and come out of our history of exploiting the forest in terms of harvest levels. If we go back 100 years, we can see this yellow bar is net growth, and the green light blue bar is removals on an annual basis. And there is a time in American history where we harvested almost twice as much as we grew each year, 100 years ago. That's completely changed. We are now at a point in modern forestry in the United States where on an annual basis, after we subtract for mortality and everything else, on an annual basis, the net growth across our forests is about twice as much as we harvest. And I'm going to mix my units. This map is in cubic feet, but if you put this into board feet, which maybe some are more familiar with, this is a gap of about 100 billion board feet that we have between our growth and harvest across the country. So it's a significant margin in terms of not over harvesting across our country and having some opportunities to invest in our forest products and in our forests, really. So I'm going to touch briefly on carbon before I wrap up, because I know that other speakers are going to touch on this more. But when we look at carbon in the forest, this is an investment opportunity. It is a way to value another ecosystem benefit of our forests and to provide the resources to support the enhancement of that value and benefit. It's an opportunity to invest in our forest resources. Because in forests, we know that carbon is stored in many different areas. It's in the trees, it's in the soils, it's in the understory components of that forest. So there's carbon throughout that system. And that carbon does change over time. As the trees grow bigger and they're harvested and they grow again, there is this cycle. And so there is a bit of fluctuation that's usually depicted in forest carbon. But one of the things to understand with forest carbon is it's a landscape opportunity. It's a landscape condition. So looking at an individual forest management unit isn't the full picture. So these charts are just reminding us that on the top, yes, you can look at an individual forest management unit. And over time, depending on harvest cycles or disturbance, wildfire, something like that, you can see that forest carbon fluctuate. But if we zoom out a little further, we look at a county or a state, that variability is moderated because across that whole landscape, there isn't something happening so frequently. And if we look even further, like some of the other slides where we look at a national scale, then you really see great stability in that overall landscape scale forest carbon storage. On an annual basis across the United States, less than 2%, about 1.2% by many measures, but less than 2% of our forest is impacted by harvesting each year. So it's a very small impact across that big forest carbon bank that we have. As was mentioned, we also have this opportunity to store carbon in harvested wood products. That's what you're all here to talk about, right? So this chart is reminding us of these 3 areas of carbon benefit with forests. On the bottom, again, you see that storage in the forest, where as the trees are growing, harvested, that's that cycle you see in green at the bottom of the slide. When materials harvested from that forest, it can go into that bar that looks like wood. That's the storage of removing trees from the forest, turning them into products, putting them into our built environment, and boom, you got that carbon stored there as well. If those forest products are used instead of higher emitting, higher impact materials, you can get this substitution benefit. And that's that big area in gray that says if you use wood instead of other higher polluting materials, you can change the scales through substitution. So bottom line, what we know is in the long-term sustainable forest management strategies can increase forest carbon stocks, provide us timber, fiber, and energy from the forest. And by doing those things together, we will have the greatest forest carbon and carbon mitigation benefit. With that, thank you very much for your time and attention. And I'm happy to be here and look forward to some questions and discussion.
Katie, great. Thank you so much, and really starting to set the stage for some further discussion. I'm now going to turn it over to George for his presentation. It looks like the slides are up. Go for it, George.
Great. Thank you, Anne. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being a part of the session this morning. So I am going to jump down several levels closer to the landscape and pick up on several of the excellent points that Katie made in the last few minutes. And where I want to begin is this look at abandoned structures across Michigan, across the Midwest, and across the US. And the reason why I'm starting here hopefully will become clear in a couple of minutes. But if you look in the left column on this table, the bottom line is we have a large number of abandoned residential structures across the United States. And these are structures that are vacant and not currently for sale, for rent, or being marketed in any sort of way. So these are truly the homes that have been walked away from. So 226,000 of these homes approximately exist in Michigan, and then you can see it scales up to nearly 6 million nationwide. And because we have a history of building with wood, that means that these abandoned structures are really large material banks storing significant quantities of wood. So if we look at just Michigan, we're seeing 1 billion board feet of lumber and that's 1 billion board feet of potentially salvageable lumber. So lumber that's in good enough condition to be reused just in the abandoned structures in the state of Michigan. And to put that into perspective, because this is some work that my group's been engaged in for the last few years, trying to think of, well, how do we get this wood back into productive use? So if we want to put it into productive use the conventional way, which is making furniture from this structural lumber, just the amount of lumber that's in these abandoned structures in Michigan homes means you would be building about 219 million end tables, 11 million dining room tables, 5.5 million picnic tables. So I mean, just crazy large scales that we would have to try to produce these products at. Or if we change our focus a little bit and really think about moving up the value chain of the raw material, of the wood material, we could then use that same volume of wood to build 839 STEM buildings at MSU, which is a mass timber building that's just wrapping up construction on our campus here at Michigan State. So our group started from this diagram a few years ago and said, well, why aren't we thinking about how to get salvaged lumber into mass timber buildings, into mass timber products? And if you're not familiar with mass timber and what it is, you'll see a couple of photos of buildings across the country. This is our MSU STEM building on campus at Michigan State. I call this the baby picture of our building because it doesn't look anything like this anymore. It's fully encapsulated in brick and limestone and glass, but it's got a timber structure, as you can see. This is Brock Commons, an 18-story timber residence hall at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. And this is Carbon 12 in Portland, Oregon, a 6-story timber building that went up in the last few years in Portland. And to figure out what a mass timber building is, it's really defined as buildings that have their primary load-bearing structure made from either solid wood or engineered wood. And most of what we're talking about is engineered wood composites, layers of wood and resin together to make these large cross-sectional structural elements. But in addition to how you might think of solid wood as like an old post and beam type building, modern mass timber buildings can also include floor decks, roof decks, and walls that are made of wood as well. So it's not just the structural elements themselves, but these planar surfaces, horizontal and vertical planar surfaces as well. Sometimes it's confused with that kind of old heavy timber construction, the difference being that while mass timber uses a bunch of new and innovative materials, it's a construction type and it's embodied in our building codes as a construction type. So let's talk a little bit about materials and work that we're doing on mass timber materials at MSU. These are two of my students doing some of the work that I'll share some information about. But quickly, if you haven't seen mass timber before, typical mass timber elements include things like glue lam or glue laminated beams and columns, like you see in this picture. So vertical columns and horizontal beams, just made up of layers of wood placed in parallel to one another and then glued to make these structural elements. You can also bend and shape glue lams into beams and arches. This is Fernholtz at Yale University School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Yale University School of the Environment, used to be Forestry and Environmental Studies. And you can also form glue lam into column and truss shapes. On the left-hand side, we see one of the labs from the Forest Products Laboratory in Madison, Wisconsin that was built in the 1930s. So glue lam itself is not a new technology. We're just looking at new applications for this material. And then the material that's gotten people really excited is cross-laminated timber, or CLT. And as you can see in this center picture, what CLT is taking 2x4 lumber and laying it up like plywood. So putting layers down to make a thicker panel product. And just like plywood, excuse me, each layer has the wood placed at 90 degrees to the layer before it and after it. So you get these perpendicular layups that make for a very strong structural product. And you can see here it's being used in floor decks that will then be covered in concrete, although they don't have to be. They just were in this application. And then on the right-hand side, you can see its use in wall panels. This is actually in a stair corridor in our STEM building at MSU. So not only is it being used in a wall application, but it's being used in a wall application that has to meet stringent fire testing requirements for egress from a building if there were to be a fire. To sort of focus on this salvaged lumber mass timber project that we've been working on at MSU, we've got some really promising performance testing results looking at lumber from a variety of different structures that were deconstructed in the state of Michigan. I won't bore you with sort of the technical details of this other than to say the wood that we're finding from these homes is strong and it performs in a very similar way mechanically and structurally to the way that virgin timber performs when it's coming from the mill. We've then, in this table, we looked at the grades of the lumber and compared it to the grade of lumber that's needed to be put into glue lam or CLT. And if you look at this column that says percent at the top, you'll notice that in most cases, we're getting well over 90% of our salvaged wood samples that are adequate to be used to make glue lam and CLT. So we can take, in essence, what was garbage, it was destined for the landfill, and we can put it into these much higher value, long-lived harvested wood products. Of course, we also know about what's going on with lumber prices right now. We've estimated that the cost to get 1,000 board feet of salvaged lumber out of a structure and to the point of remanufacture is about $833 per 1,000 board feet. A year ago, that was a terrible number. That was too expensive, too high. No one was willing to pay that. And if we look at lumber future prices, and I just pulled this chart this morning so we could get the up to the minute data, the last vertical bar here is from May 6th. On May 6th, random length framing lumber composite prices were over $1,400 per 1,000 board feet. So we're starting to see some economic dynamics change in terms of what might be possible with salvaged lumber compared to where we were a year or two ago when lumber was, as you can see here, November of 20, lumber was down below $600 per 1,000 board feet. But then we have to think about other values as well. And are there other values that this material brings to the table? And so I'll turn your attention to this table. And again, not there, there won't be a test on this. I'm certainly not looking to make anyone go blind on these kind of technical details. So I'll just focus in here. And what you're seeing is on the left side, you're looking at emissions from the manufacturing of virgin softwood lumber originating in the Pacific Northwest and the Southeastern United States. And then on the right, you're looking at emissions from salvaged framing lumber, reclaimed framing lumber. And we can see that CO2 from biogenic sources and from fossil sources accounts for about 99% of the emissions in the manufacturing of lumber. So we're just going to focus on carbon then as a result. And what you'll see here is that if you compare the emissions from salvaged lumber versus the emissions from processing virgin material, you'll see that there's anywhere from a 310 to an 11,000% lower rate of emission by using reclaimed lumber in whatever the further processing is that you're going to do with it, because the carbon that was accounted for during the manufacture of that lumber is already embodied in that lumber. We're just extracting it and giving it a longer life. The other side, of course, is that long-lived wood products store carbon for longer periods of time in buildings. So if we look at our MSU STEM building, we see that there's about 1,856 metric tons of CO2 stored in the wood components of the building, which you can see the equivalents here: 4.5 million vehicle miles, 394 cars that are driven for a year, 222 homes energy use for a year. But we have to get to this avoided manufacturing emissions of steel and concrete, like Katie was talking about, to really see where the bigger impact in these kind of buildings will come from. And so if we look at this idea of the substitution effect, substituting wood for concrete and steel, we can look at some work that was done in this large national study by these players here in the bulleted list. And all they did was created 3 pairs of similar buildings that were done in mass timber and concrete in 3 locations across the United States. And the results were telling. Red and blue bars represent CLT and glulam. So you can see the material contribution to global warming potential from the glulam and the CLT. But now you can compare that to the gray bar and the light blue bar, which is concrete and rebar used for reinforcing that concrete. And so what you see is that when you move to mass timber, you get these large global warming potential reductions: 43% in the 8-story model building, 44% in the 12-story model building, and then 30% in the 18-story building, which is kind of a building code issue, and the fact that they actually have to use more drywall in those taller mass timber buildings. And so you get some emissions coming back from the drywall. But substitution effect is real. And this data sort of shows us what the scale of that substitution effect could be as we bring more mass timber buildings on. So with that, I'll thank you for your time and turn it over to Dave.
Great. Thanks, George. And Dave, it is over to you. And just to remind the participants, if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the chat.
I guess this is what it feels like to be a deer in the headlights. Several clicks away. It's a real pleasure to be here. I just want to confirm that my presentation's up on the screen.
Yes, it is.
Okay. Well, again, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's great to be batting cleanup in this great lineup of speakers. Though I will note that sometimes the cleanup batter is the most disappointing spot in the rotation. But this probably tells you how much I'd like to see a baseball game this year. In any case, I'm here to talk about maybe the intersection of the last two presentations and this notion that that wood products markets interact with the forest that's stored in, or excuse me, the carbon that's stored in forest and also in the area of forests that we see on the landscape, as Catherine mentioned earlier. So I start with this assertion that the wood products industry has a really strong influence on the structure of forests in the United States, and especially on private lands. Markets for these durable wood products alter land uses indirectly and have an effect both on the carbon that is stored in these forests as well as in the built environment in urban areas. And then ask the question, how do you go about using this carbon sink dynamic to actually build out some more carbon benefits to enhance carbon sequestration across the system? And as you might anticipate, I'll be looking at this at a fairly broad scale, generally at the national and some at the regional level as well. So as a bit of background, I just point out that forests in the United States cover about 1/3 of the land area, and also that forests are almost evenly split between public ownership and private ownership. The public includes federal, state, and other small public entities. And 48% of it is private. And if we look across regions, and the chart here shows ownership by region, it's pretty clear that in the West, public land ownership dominates. And so that forest conditions there are controlled largely by administrative policy and by public land use rules. In the Eastern United States, in both what I've labeled the North and the South, private lands are clearly dominant. And in these areas, we would expect that market conditions dominate choices regarding land use and land use switching. I'd point out that the South, which produces 60% of all timber products in the nation, is nearly 90% private forest and has been for a long time. So land use is fairly stable on public lands, but if we look at private lands, and in this case, we're looking at non-federal lands as an aggregate category, there have been two dominant trends. The top graph shows area by land use between 1982 and 2012 using the NRI data, and shows that cropland has declined substantially since the 1980s, largely driven by increased productivity and consolidation of the agricultural sector. But the cropland has declined by about 69 million acres since 1982. At the same time, developed land uses, urban in this graph, has actually increased by about 42 million acres. So this gets to Catherine's observation that there have been an incredible amount of land use dynamics altering the landscape of the United States over many decades. But if we look at forest area, which is the purple line at the very top, they show that it's amazingly stable over this period and actually has increased somewhat. We know that forests have been affected by urbanization, and we can see that in the bottom chart here, where I've shown the changes that have affected forest area in the United States from 1982 to 2012. These are lagged change rates. If we look at the red bar, it shows that between 82 and 87, there was about 1 million acres of agricultural land transitioning to forest cover. And that million acre average sort of held through the 1990s up until about 2000. At the same time, nearly 1 million acres on average, well, that's about 750,000 acres per year, were being urbanized. You can see that in in the bottom. And so on net, we had a slight gain in forest area between the 80s and the 2012, about a 3 million acre gain in spite of all of this loss to urban uses. And we're going to take those land use changes that I just charted from 1982 to 2012 and map them out across the counties of the United States. We get some pretty interesting patterns. Almost all of the change has been focused in the eastern United States, though I would say that some of the areas in the West, especially around Seattle, have been substantial and consequential. But we've seen these two dynamics. There's been a strong growth in urban areas. These are the purple areas where we see forest loss. And then we've seen shift toward forests in many rural areas. And there are really two dynamics driving that latter change. One is an agricultural reversion in the north, in many cases simply no longer being feasible for agricultural production. We see cropland shifting to pasture land, shifting to forest land, largely through natural regeneration. And then in the southeast or in the south, we see a very strong investment driven change in land use, with land use switching to forest associated with timber markets. And a very strong association with timber prices in this region. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail in a little bit. And getting back to this question about wood products and carbon storage, I think by virtue of you being on this presentation, you understand that forests are nature's carbon capture and storage system. That photosynthesis is constantly fixing carbon from the atmosphere and into biomass. And that while mortality, harvesting, and decomposition are releasing carbon back to the atmosphere, on net, there's been a very strong carbon sink represented by standing forest. Less well understood is that wood products store woody biomass in infrastructure. And so if we think about forest as a cycling carbon system, where harvested forests become regenerated and recapture the carbon that was harvested, we have this carbon sink in the form of the built environment that's taking much of that carbon that was harvested and placing it into a fixed form that can be stored for many, many years. The research that I'm aware of says that the average life of a house is about 80 years, and that wood products are about 50% carbon by weight. And so these are long-lived storage vessels for forest carbon that actually augment the carbon that is maximally stored in forest conditions. But if we can take that carbon from wood products at the end of that 80-year lifetime, let's say, and we can recycle it in ways that George mentioned, then you get an even longer life of persistent carbon. But even if you don't capture it and it gets stored in solid waste systems, it can be stored for even longer periods of time, for hundreds of years, where it is eventually going to emit, but will be stored in that condition in solid waste systems. So let's look at change over time. If we look at forest-related carbon stocks, and that's the top, and I've broken it out by forest biomass, forest products, and forest soil, you can see that we've had fairly stable forest soil carbon. Though in some ways that's an artifact of how we measure it, but also very strong growth in forest biomass that accounts for much of the carbon sink. In addition, and in this top graph, very hard to distinguish, we've had growth in carbon sinks represented by products and landfills. So an interesting statistic to me is that if we look at all of the carbon that's stored in forests right now, absent products, that represents about 50 times the emissions from the US economy as measured in 2018. And if we go to this bottom graphic here and look at forest carbon sinks from products, you can see that the carbon product flux is fairly substantial in comparison to the estimate of sink from forests as well. And I should back up a minute. What I'm saying when I make a distinction between stock and sink, the stock is simply the carbon that's stored on the landscape. The sink, which is the amount of carbon that's coming out of the atmosphere, is the net change in that stock over time. And so the top line, the red line here in the bottom graph, shows the forest carbon flux in standing forests, and the blue line shows the carbon flux in forests. And so that's the net change in those stocks, the amount of increase in those carbon stocks. And we'll look a little bit more carefully at that wood product carbon sink and show that basically, if we look at the red line, that's carbon products in use. The green line is carbon products, carbon in the products that are in landfills. And then the blue line is sort of a superimposed total US housing start indicator. And it shows that there's a very strong correspondence between wood utilization for housing and wood stored in the built environment. I would also note that the amount of wood that's stored per unit of housing has been going down over time, indicating a substitution away from wood in many cases that maybe defines a potential moving forward. Now, I just want to emphasize some of these points real quickly with some observations from the southeastern US. The Southeast is where most of the growth, nearly all the growth in forest product output has come from. If we look at growth over time, it's roughly doubled between the 1950s and 60s and 2000. That growth accelerated in the 80s up until the peak just before 2000. Had a steady shift in production, strong demand increases in this region. It's shifted production towards softwoods. Now 75% of all wood in the South is softwoods, and it's begun to favor smaller diameter uniform materials. And I would point out that this red region of the graph is the softwoods that are small diameter softwoods. And this has seen steady growth over this period in spite of cyclical effects on solid wood products and the like. A very important dynamic. So this is a chart that takes the South out of the US. Chart that I showed you earlier shows that there's been a strong dynamic favoring forests, where we've had the strongest forest gains in the region, and the markets have largely driven those changes. The big part of that market-driven change has been in forest investment. That's led to an increase in planted pine, especially in that period between 1980 and 2000. And during that period, we've seen a strong adjustment in the amount of softwood inventory. It grew over time until 1980 to 2000, where we saw a flattening of growth in forest biomass and forest carbon, but then an acceleration of growth in response to investor-led investment in planted pines. And so a strong shift toward timber production in the South. But if we look over here to these two graphs, it indicates that that strong shift in production has led to a strong increase in carbon storage in both products and in standing forests. And with that, I'll conclude and point out that there is a document online, Forest Carbon 201, and Google will get you there. That goes into some of these observations in more detail. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, all the speakers. We actually have gotten some questions, and so why don't I go ahead and put some of these out there. The first one, and Dave, this may be one that you could respond to initially, and that's, how have the West Coast and California wildfires changed forest and wood product storage estimates?
So, as I look at, I'll go back to the statistic that we have about 50 times an annual carbon emission stored in carbon stocks. I mean, as I think about moving forward in terms of policy to affect carbon sequestration, I think in two terms. One is a wood products driven uh, demand for land use and enhanced carbon storage in the East. I think about policy that would stabilize carbon stocks in the West, where wildfires are a dominant part of the landscape. I don't think we've seen enough loss in inventory to affect our projections of forest production yet, but that's something to keep an eye on.
And another question from one of the participants. This looks like it's addressing a comment you just made again, Dave. The panelists just mentioned that currently U.S. forests represent 50 times the carbon emissions of the U.S. economy. Is that the standing carbon stored in forests or the annual amount sequestering from forests?
It's referring to stock. So that's the carbon that's accumulated in forests across the nation. And roughly, I think it's 52 times the annual emissions in 2018.
Great, thank you. Another question has come up, and George, I think this might be for you. You talked a lot about the deconstruction and salvaging of lumber for use and long-lived wood products, basically upping our recycling. Are there social impacts related to that process? And can you point to any specific examples?
Yeah, absolutely. There's sort of countless examples of how this is being done at the local level across the United States, but I think probably the best scalable example is right near Washington, D.C. in Baltimore. Baltimore Wood Project has been running for the last several years. It's changed the way it operates a little bit in the last year, in part due to COVID. But it's a partnership between the Forest Service, a social services agency in the Baltimore area, and then a number of corporations. And the idea is that they've got this linked sort of systems driven concept where deconstruction and material salvage are linked tightly together. The companies that provide those services, the deconstruction and salvage services, tend to generally employ people who've been impacted by the criminal justice system, perhaps have had drug addiction or alcohol addiction issues, basically some bar to employment in the conventional sense. And they've employed those individuals using the takedown of these derelict homes in Baltimore as the impetus to get people jobs training, get them skilled, basically get them over some of those employment hurdles. And I think the really big success story that's come out of Baltimore is this notion now of social impact bonds, where private organizations in a location will invest in operations like what the Baltimore project was doing, recognizing the fact that businesses are contributing a significant amount of their tax revenue that they generate to paying for the criminal justice system, for drug treatment, for all of these other services. But if those funds could be diverted to creating positive social impact on the landscape, that's probably a better investment of their funds. So that happened in Baltimore, and now that social impact bonding is being replicated, I believe, in St. Louis. There have been discussions about looking at it in Detroit, but it's really a replicable, scalable model that can be implemented in other places around the country.
Great. Well, thanks for pointing that out. And having been on several field trips to the Baltimore field site, I can tell, especially the Hill staff who are attending, the Forest Climate Working Group would love to arrange field trips for that particular project, because it's such a great and the backyard example of what we've been talking about. One of the issues that continuously comes up with regard to forests and carbon is the really the tracking of that carbon and where it is going, and can we actually validate that we're accomplishing the carbon sequestration goals. And it's clear to me that we can, for example, there's a salmonella outbreak in leafy greens. We know where. Frequently it's Yuma, Arizona. We know exactly what field it is. We know when it was harvested, and we can tell the consumer not to get certain bags of fresh greens. can we do something similar to that with regard to forest products and wood products in particular? And maybe an additional question around that is, does forest certification systems that are out there, can they contribute to that? So two different things, but mostly it's about tracking carbon. So I don't know who want to take that on, but Katie, great. I was hoping you'd say yes.
Well, I'm happy to, because I've worked as a forest certification auditor and very familiar with chain of custody systems. And so there's two ways I think to answer this question about tracking forest products and how that can feed into accounting for forest carbon storage in harvested wood products. One answer to this question is yes, this is already happening. There are systems in place, primarily proprietary systems that companies use for their own tracking. So part of the question here is how can we have more of this private information feeding into public reporting systems? So that's one answer, is there are systems in place for tracking, trees to the stump and to harvest units and products back to the forest. That does exist. Largely it's proprietary. Where we do see aggregated information, sometimes that doesn't give the level of detail that some stakeholders are looking for. The second answer to this question in my mind is to understand the differences between the lettuce example and many of our forested products. Right now in the United States, our lettuce production comes from about 2 or 4 counties, a couple counties in Arizona, a couple counties in California. So when there's a problem with a product like that, like lettuce, without knowing anything more, you're already down to a very small part of the landscape that could be the source of that problem. The same scenario exists for some of our forest products and for some of our manufacturers that have a small sourcing footprint. So if you know the species of wood and you know the manufacturer, it can be very much like the lettuce example, where it instantly gets you into a small part of the landscape. But other products are sourced much differently. They're more like commodity grain, that if there was a problem with a commodity grain product, you'd have to figure out the whole Midwest for your sourcing. So like I said, systems exist for tracking. They're out there already. Figuring out how to aggregate that, make more of that information publicly accessible is kind of a technical and proprietary discussion. The other part of it is recognizing the difference between different forest products and their sourcing footprint and the complexity of those supply chains.
Sorry, there was a addendum to that question that you might want to address, and that is, do these estimates in tracking carbon from tree to building or end wood product, do these estimates encompass the carbon emitted from the entire process? And so starting, really, it's the whole life cycle. And do we have the numbers associated with the life cycle, including ecosystem carbon?
George, were you going to say something on that? Go ahead, George.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, yes. The course answer is yes. We know some of these things. Of course, the problem with life cycle assessment and these carbon budgeting type scenarios is they're very contextual and they're very context specific. One thing we know is that if you look at wood remanufacturing between the Pacific Northwest and the southeastern United States, biomass is burned for fuel differently in different parts of the country, and that has a big contextual difference in how those life cycle assessments look. I mean, that's just one example. We're doing a project this summer where we're trying to sort of refresh data that the Forest Service had generated about 11 years ago on understanding what's involved with the deconstruction process, the building deconstruction process to get to the wood. So we're looking at sort of, I think what your question is asking more about, like what kind of carbon emissions are involved in the process of actually getting to the material. And so Forest Service had done that work about 11 years ago. Methods have changed, a lot of technique has changed. And so we're looking to refresh some of that data now. So it's out there. I'll be honest, it's not always in the most accessible and easy to use formats, unfortunately, right? The decision makers that could benefit the most from the information often can't get to it, or if they can get to it, it's just not accessible, to anything other than like a highly technical audience. But yeah, that information's out there and it can be parsed out if we got into this sort of carbon tracking idea, it could be included in that.
Well, there are a whole lot more questions that have been coming in, and unfortunately we've run to the end of our time. So I might ask Kylie if you could address how we will provide any information following this Latte and Learn.
Sure. Yep, so we will have, I posted, there's a link in the chat or in one of the question and answer there, where we'll post the presentation slides and the video from today's presentation, as well as we'll post any subsequent questions, any questions that were unanswered, we'll have those answered there, and as well as a sort of a wrap-up summary from today's
Great.
chat. So thank you for everyone.
Thanks very much, Kylie. And everyone, I'd like to thank the panelists. You did a great job, and I think you hit it out of the park, so to speak, given Dave's previous baseball analogy. And I think it was really, really helpful, in the fact that we've gotten so many questions suggests that we, in fact, were digging into a subject that people would like to learn more about. I know Dave Ware did post in his final remarks, or his concluding slide, I think, reference to a product that's on the RFF Resources for the Future website. There's a few other pieces in there, as well as connections to other reports that people might find helpful. So hopefully between our response to the cues and getting the slides up, as well as some of the other materials available through all of the websites, actually, that are part of our speakers, you should be able to get some answers. If not, please feel free to reach out to Forest Climate Working Group, and we can do follow-up with you. So with that, I'd like to thank you for joining us at this Latte and Learn, and hopefully you'll join us in the next one, to be determined what the subject is. And in fact, my final pitches for those who are still on the line is we're here to help answer your questions. And so if there are things that you would really like to know more about and want to have a deeper dive with regard to forest and climate and land use, please let us know, and we will get it into the list of possible speakers. So again, thank you very much, and look forward to seeing you in the future. Take care, everybody.